Hello, hello. This is our fifth and final debate prep for the negative side on a variety of election reform topics. Okay, so here at Debate Prep, what we do is we are prepping out speeches one at a time on the affirmative and the negative for various different topics. And our topic for today is that the United States federal government should significantly increase the ability to vote by mail. And so we are opposed to that. So we don't want to significantly increase the ability to vote by mail. We need to respond to some arguments, and so let's get at it. Okay, the a few things about this program is that we use Chat GPT to kind of help illustrate some of the arguments, like the actual wording and generation of ideas and brainstorming and things like that. We very much embrace that technology aspect. Okay, and so we're going to be doing that right now. Here we go. So we're going to be using ChatGPT. I've been using a whole lot of this, but remember that you are the negative on this debate. That means that the affirmative has already made some arguments, and so in order to participate in this level of preparation, what you need to do is to be able to have a transcript of what somebody already said. Now, maybe somebody posted their arguments on why we should have more mail-in voting, or maybe you're part of a formal debate, an academic debate, and this is the topic. Regardless of the situation, you're going to want to refute something that is said in the first affirmative. And so I have here a argument about accessibility. All right. So the person made the argument that mail-in voting allows many advantages regarding accessibility and participation in the democratic process. And all I did was copy and paste that. But the prompt that I wrote in is imagine you are the negative in a debate with a topic that the USFG should significantly increase the ability to vote by mail. USFG is a common acronym for United States federal government. Refute this 1AC argument, this first affirmative constructive argument. And so, boom, let's put that in there. Oh no. So what happens when you have something went wrong? What I like to do is I like to make sure I copy my whole prompt, and then I try to regenerate. But then I'm going to reload. Okay, but I still have that on the clipboard. So checking my browser. Come on now. This is a little embarrassing. There we go. I must have had it open too long without using it. All right, so I still have it on the clipboard, so now I can just paste it back in there. Remember, we're going to refute the accessibility argument for mail-in voting. Okay, here it is. As a negative debate, I would argue that while mail-in voting may have some advantages, it is not without its flaws and potential negative consequences. Firstly, mail-in voting can lead to higher rates of voter fraud. Voter fraud is not a refutation to accessibility. Right now, when you're refuting an argument, what you're doing is criticizing the central claim of the argument. Now, while the topic is about mail-in voting, and this is relevant to the debate in general, this is not direct refutation to accessibility. I would save this highlighted part where it says about voter fraud for a disadvantage. We'll get into that a little bit later, but I'm going to say, all right, I'm not saying that one. Additionally, mail-in voting can also lead to logistical challenges such as delays in delivering processing ballots. That is disadvantage as well. Mail-in voting can be subject to political manipulation, disadvantage. Lastly, may not necessarily increase participation in the democratic process, as some people may still choose not to vote, even with the option to do so by mail. Okay, that one is kind of direct refutation to the accessibility argument for mail-in voting. Okay, okay, so now let me just boom. I'm going to copy the second one here. Now, so what I'm pointing out with this prompt is that it is giving you an overall strategy. It's not giving you direct refutation to accessibility. In fact, you might have to drop that argument because the accessibility argument doesn't seem like it's something. Mail-in voting doesn't decrease accessibility. Like, I don't understand how that would make it less accessible to people, and that would be one way to do refutation. Oh, you can do the argument that it doesn't make it accessible to everyone, right? So that is one argument. Let's do this. Like, I click now refute this advantage. Make sure to stick with only direct refutation. This is the election integrity. Okay. So the accessibility one, I think you might just have to kind of make a strategic concession for that argument, because allowing people to vote by mail is more accessible. Like, you would have to challenge on a different level. Um, it's not necessarily so. This one is about voting integrity, election integrity. Mail-in votes does provide a paper trail. This does not necessarily guarantee the accuracy and integrity of elections. That one is a direct refutation, and so Chat GPT is pretty famous for saying not necessarily. Not necessarily is an argument. It's just not a winning argument. What you're doing is letting the affirmative win less. All right. But it doesn't mean that they're losing. All right. They're just not winning by as much. There is some value in making that argument, but you have to find a reason why mail in voting just not isn't like the best. It's just there's negative consequences to it as well. Or there ought to be some logical differences. Okay. Mail-in voting can also lead to logistical challenges such as delays in delivery. That was already said before. Additionally, while mail-in voting can be helpful for military personnel, it's not without its challenges. For example, mail-in ballots may be subject to delays or lost transit. That's the same thing. Okay, so so ChatGPT is not doing a great job on just refuting the arguments for mail-in voting. Okay, so I'm gonna go check this out. Generate a solvency takeout. So this is kind of like debate jargon, but ChatGPT has so far proven to be able to handle it. Basically saying that you don't solve for this uh, uh, based on the fact that mail-in voting is already widely utilized. No, it's not a solvency takeout. I'm sorry, it's an inherency. Inherency takeout based on the fact that mail-in voting is already hardly widely utilized. So this is where understanding the importance of stock issues really comes in handy. Okay, explain why inherency is a stock issue and the significance to debate. Okay, so inherency is a very integral part of any affirmative case. And so if you can do an inherency takeout in this case would be that mail-in voting is already widely utilized in many states and jurisdictions, which means that there's no need to significantly increase its ability since it's already available to many voters. So what you're doing is pointing out it's like mail-in voting, yes, it's more accessible, but it's already accessible. We don't need to do anything about it. Inherency is a stock issue in debate because it deals with whether or not the problem being addressed by the affirmative actually exists and whether it can be solved by the proposed plan. Inherency is significant because it establishes the necessity for a plan and helps the judge determine whether the affirmative proposal solution is viable and necessary, right? It's like, yes, mail-in voting is a good idea, but that doesn't mean we need to pass a federal law that proposes it, that makes it that way. Okay, so in this case, if the affirmative is arguing that there's a significant problem with accessibility and participation in the democratic process that can be addressed by significantly increasing the ability to vote by mail, the negative can argue that this problem may not be as significant as claimed since mail-in voting is already widely utilized, right? So you either have to have evidence that you either don't have evidence that there's an accessibility problem, or if you do have evidence that there's an accessibility problem, it's not because of mail-in voting restrictions, right? That's not It's like that's, or you could just say it's like it's just a hypothetical thing. So what you're trying to do is you're pushing the affirmative to prove that there are actual accessibility issues with elections right now, not hypothetical accessibility issues if they aren't allowed to vote by mail. People are allowed to vote by mail. Like right, and so you got to push them into proposing it. So like an inherency press, I think, is going to give you some pretty good defense in this particular case. All right. Now, also, so let's do generate a disadvantage. I'm just going to put DA that focuses on mail delays. I'm going to specify uniqueness, link, internal link impact. Okay. Boom. Those are the stock issues for disadvantages. You got to know what the stock issues are for advantages, for disadvantages, for counterplans, for critiques, for topicality. And that really, really helps draft really good prompts for Chat GPT. Take a look. What it's doing is it's organizing it based on uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. The uniqueness. Currently, United States Postal Service is experiencing significant delays in mail delivery. Link, the implementation of a significant increase in mail voting could exacerbate these delays. Internal link, the delays of a mail service could result in many mail-in ballots not being received or processed in time to be counted, which could lead to significant issues with the accuracy. Impact, it undermines the effectiveness and integrity of mail-in voting, right? So that could be some offense for you, right? That like what you're doing is making it so it's much more likely that we have delays or even fail to count certain votes by using mail. And so saying that like encouraging people to go to the polls actually is just a more efficient way of doing things because we don't have to wait for the mail to deliver everything, and we have a lot more. We're a lot more secure in knowing that the votes have been processed because they're all in one place. They're at the polling place, whereas by mail-in vote, they have to like come in from certain areas, right? That's one way of doing it. But I'm going to recommend generate a federalism critique of for the one AC. Federal. Oops, I transposed the I and the S. Okay. Now, a critique is basically questioning more fundamental principles to the affirmatives case. And so, federalism is a system of government. Probably is going to say right here, federalism critique in this context would be to argue that the implementation of a significant increase in mail-in voting is not a decision that should be made at the federal level, but rather should be left to individual states to decide. The critique would argue that this is because the Constitution grants states the power to oversee and administer their own elections. So this isn't that mail-in voting is inherently bad. It's that a federal requirement for mail-in voting violates the Constitution or is anti-federalist. And so you want to make sure that this is more about the fundamental principles. You could still argue that and this is where the inherency argument works really well, is that on a state level, the movement is already toward more and more mail-in voting. Even though that there's pushback right now, the trajectory, it's still popular for more and more mail-in voting. And so overall, there is a direction that's being taken, and so that system is already working. And the critique makes it so that we should allow that to continue to work. You can even work really well with the argument about election integrity, because one of the things that makes voter fraud so difficult in the United States is the fact that it is decentralized as a process. And so the more and more that you centralize it, the more you make elections to be something that is administered on a federal level rather than the state level, the more you give access to people to is to undermine the integrity of those elections. Those things are now, are centralized. It's like if everything's going through the post office, it makes it easier for you to inject false ballots or remove actual ballots from postal delivery, right? And so if you know where the the ballots, what the method is, it's a lot easier for people to exploit any weaknesses. Where if you leave it decentralized the way it is, then there will be so much variety that the energy needed to commit voter fraud at a level significant to change outcomes is just impossible to achieve. So the federalism critique, I think, really is something that actually works pretty well in this one. Um, boom. She left up to the impact of the critique would undermine. Oh, so they even do impacts. Okay. uh, would be to undermine the affirmative's argument that a significant increase in mail-in voting is necessary and effective at the national level. Instead, the critique would argue that such a decision should be left up to states. And now it does kind of open up some theoretical positions to generate a state's counterplan. I'm just going to put CP. But propose that individual states, rather than the federal government, should decide whether to increase the ability to vote by mail. This counterplan would argue that states are better positioned to make decisions regarding election policies and procedures and are more familiar with it. Under the state's counterplan, the individual states would be able to choose whether to implement mail-in voting and to what extent, based on factors such as population density, demographics, and historical voter turnout. States could also choose to implement mail-in voting in different ways, such as by mailing ballots to all registered voters or allowing voters to request mail-in ballots. So, like, talking about the variety of choices that might be made from state to state kind of heightens your federalism talk. I do think that positioning yourself in this sort of with this sort of critique of a federalist mandate, I think sets up an overall narrative that is good for at least two reasons. One is because you don't need to directly argue that mail-in voting sucks, right? We were trying to do that with the refutation, and it was kind of coming up weak, right? But two, it takes the debate and puts it onto different ground rather than just like mail-in voting good. You're saying it's like fine, I can grant that, but but the federal mandate is the bad part. And remember, if your topic has a specific clause in it, says that the United States federal government should make mail-in voting, significantly increase the ability to vote by mail, then like that's a necessary part of what the affirmative has to defend. They have to defend that the federal government is doing these things. So I do think like the federalism approach on this one, it might be one of the stronger approaches to it, but also reducing the but I think that like saying mail-in voting is bad. Like I would avoid that on the affirmative. What I would say is mail-in voting already is very popular, right? And so what you're doing is that removes the so you can make the inherency takeout its own voting issue. And so let me show you this. Explain why inherency is a voting issue. You're setting up your rebuttal to talk about why an inherency takeout means that the debate is lost for the affirmative. Inherency is a voting issue in a debate because it is one of the essential components of a valid affirmative case. Inherency establishes that the problem being addressed by the affirmative exists and there's a need for the proposed solution. Inherency is a voting issue because it directly impacts the judge's decision on the merits of the affirmative case. If the negative successfully challenges the inherency on the affirmative case, the judge cannot vote in favor of the affirmative plan. Additionally, if the negative provides stronger evidence for inherency, the judge may be more likely to vote against the affirmative. It's also significant because it helps frame the debate and establish the parameters of the argument. All right, so you can look over, like review inherency. That's the weakest part of the mail-in voting affirmative case, and it launches a whole bunch of other sort of solutions. So like, the efficiency of the mail now becomes like a variable from state to state, that you could throw in there about whether or not states should be required to send it out to people, or if they want to, if they understand their constituents better and send it out to people who request it. So but I do think, I think you should look into the federalism argument, the federalism critique, and the possibility of a states-based counterplan would be a good way to go. All right. Other than that, I think that the mail in, yeah, I don't think I'd even waste any energy on trying to refute whether or not mail in voting is more accessible than face-to-face voting. I don't think like that. I think that's just kind of a waste of time that you have, um, that really sort of take the focus of the debate off of the benefits of mail-in voting and put it on the importance of, of the federal government versus states governments and how that might work. You could go extra long. You could do a politics disadvantage if you wanted to. I mean, I would look, check that out. I did that um, for other preparations as well. And so the politics disadvantage, that this would piss off one political party at the expense of the other, and that there would be retribution and pushback on these things. You Sometimes people want to do like constitutionality arguments, and that's okay. Like if you want to explain that this is unconstitutional, and you want to get into that, especially if you're like pre-law, or um, just a lawyer, if you want to participate in that argument as well. Um, the constitutionality, but then constitutionality like is more of, it's also more of a critique than it is a disadvantage, because it's more of a principle of, the rule of law, and not necessarily a practical disadvantage with definitive impacts to it, right? Like, maybe violating the constitution is a good thing. I don't know. It's like, people make those arguments in academic debates all the time, but it's just a way of pointing out the lack of impacts on it. So I think this becomes a little bit more of a debate on principle, because you don't necessarily need to be opposed to voting by mail. The debate is more about who gets to make that decision, and what does that decision look like in a sort of policy framework. All right. So this was one of the shorter prep sessions, and I think that might be based on the topic. Let's see here. If there's, but that kind of incorporates everything that I was seeing. It's like, so the delays, um, and we did some refutation on the fraud, but yeah, do a little bit of inherency takeout, do a little bit of critiquing, and maybe do a counter plan to kind of, you know, bolster the alternative, if you wanted to. Right. So as always, if you've got any questions or just comments, like, put them in the comments. All right. You know, retweet, post this, like, just let me know. I'll try to get to them as whenever I can. All right. I'd love to hear from anybody who's watching this. All right. Okay. So that's my take on um, how to argue the negative on the topic about mandatory voting, for like an academic debate. If you got any other topics, let me know. I would love to analyze them for you. Okay. All right.